Welcome to Reclaiming Home, a podcast focused on delivering thoughtful conversation and tangible actions to make housing justice a reality in our communities. I'm your host, Asale Sol Young, Executive Director of Housing in Action, an educator, activist, and proud Turtle Papa. I'm a Black legacy native of Evanston, Illinois, and a proud descendant of Haitians and rural Black and Indigenous North Carolinians. Join me as we take time each month to dive into all things housing, including potential policies, community dreams, persistent systemic barriers, neighborhood successes, and anything and everything in between. We're so glad you're joining us. Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of Reclaiming Home. This is our first ever live recording. And today I am joined by an incredible panel of affordable housing leaders for the finale of our affordable housing deep dive series. Starting with Jesse, we're going to just kick off introductions. So folks on the panel, if you can just start by sharing your name, your pronouns, your job title, and your organization, and how you got into housing justice. We'll start with you, Jesse.
Hello, my name is Jessie Hendel. I use she, her pronouns. I am the executive director of Alliance Housing. And I got into housing justice work about 25 years ago, working in shelter and transitional housing. And I think really in that experience, the importance of a stable home and was really motivated to continue working in the space. Carla.
Good afternoon, Carla Henderson, she, her pronouns. I am the president and CEO of Project for Pride in Living, and really got focused in housing when I came on as Senior VP of Housing Stability in March of 2024 at PPL, but have done a ton of equitable development and community development work. Most majority has been in the municipal sector, so working for cities and counties and developing equitable project communities. And so with that, I will turn it over to Kizzy.
Thank you, Carla. Hi, my name is Kizzy Downey, and I am the CEO of Model Cities of St. Paul, and I use she, her pronouns. And I got into housing justice work through my work here at Model Cities as well. I've been with the organization for about 16 years. And so I've worked across multiple facets of the organization, including work with families in housing. And so really just had an opportunity to learn more about different kind of elements of how we work with families and individuals across the housing spectrum. So that's how I got into the housing justice work. So I will pass it on to Will.
Hey, thanks, Kizzy. Nice to see everybody today. Will Delaney, he, him pronouns. My title is Interim Co-Executive Director at Hope Community. I have in another month, it'll be 17 years actually that I've been here at Hope. So time flies. But and without kind of going too far into my journey into housing justice, I would say what really got me interested in housing specifically was that after college, I lived for a few years in New York City and Brooklyn. This was in the mid 2000s, kind of before the housing crash, but really got to see up close the effects of gentrification. Neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy and Brooklyn and other places that were just rapidly becoming unaffordable to communities who had lived there for generations. And it got me down the path of how in the world does any of this work and why is this the status quo and what do you do? And so long story short, I ended up back here in Minneapolis and had the good fortune of finding my way to Hope Community, and I've been here ever since getting to work on these issues. And I think that leaves Kirsten, so I'll pass to you.
Thanks, Will. Hi, everyone. Kirsten Birch, she, her pronouns. I am executive director at PRG, which is a HUD certified housing counseling organization and community developer. I often say that housing work found me, not the other way around. I think as a descendant of the Rondo community in St. Paul, like the meaning and the impact of home and place and stability has always been in my DNA. I just didn't always know it.
And my perspective and commitment to this work is really shaped by my own lived experience, as well as professional experiences in direct service, serving in local government, and contributing to systems change efforts. And I think across all four of those, I've seen how housing is at the root of so many challenges, and how instability can derail everything in somebody's life, and how stability can really open doors to possibility and prosperity. And so I don't necessarily think of myself as a traditional housing leader, but really someone who cares deeply about scaling what works to help people and challenging the status quo to uncover something better. So I'll hand it back to Sally. So
Thanks for that, Kristen. And thank you, everyone. As a reminder to our longtime listeners and a new intro to those joining us today, I'm Asali Soul. My preferred pronouns are they, them, and I'm the executive director here at Housing in Action. If you're new to Housing in Action, we're a 30-year-old nonprofit leading the fight for housing justice so that all people have a safe, stable, and dignified place to live. And with that, we're going to begin our conversation. We're going to start with a pretty heavy hitter. And so I'm actually going to turn this first question to you, Carla. What are the current biggest threats to affordable housing today?
Well, thank you. Yes, you are kicking it off with a with the entree. There's no appetizer here. So I definitely would say that the biggest threat is the fact that there's not enough supply, and that even um, if there was enough supply, that there are our population is not making the income, so the even the affordable units are not in reach with the citizenry that we're trying to reach in affordable housing. I also think supportive housing funding is has been cut over the years, and so with all the efforts of trying to get people that are experiencing long-term homelessness into stable housing, it's not enough just to give them the property or the house or the unit. It is actually, you have to provide the supportive housing, something that we do here at PPL, and with the complexities of everything that faces individuals that are currently unhoused, there's just not enough funding to provide the services that are needed. And I think also some of the public funding priorities that start to get shifted need to kind of be realigned with what needs to happen in the housing ecospace.
Carla, can you expand on that last point a little bit? Like, what are the ways that you feel the funding streams can shift in order to really meet the need where it's at?
Yeah, so I talked about we don't have enough, and then what if we did have enough, that we don't have the affordability is complex. But a lot of our housing stock that we currently have that is affordable does not have the necessary capital improvement resources. And so I'm talking to a bunch of housers on the call that know that, when we do the low income tax credit, federal law says it has to stay affordable for 15 years. Here in the state of Minnesota, we say 30 years, but there's really not a funding stream to make the capital improvements that need to be made. And so, as anybody knows that has aging infrastructure, new roofs are needed, and hot water heaters and windows to keep things efficient. And so when I talk about shifting a priority of capitalization needs for the existing housing, because it's great to build some new buildings. We have 3 that are coming online at the end of the year, but then we have a significant amount of our portfolio that is in dire need of some capitalization funding.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Will, could you expand?
Ooh, okay. Well, yeah, thank you, Carla. That was a great intro. I guess what I would say is at its root, our biggest challenge isn't a new challenge. And it's that when we're talking about affordable housing, whether it's affordable rental housing or affordable ownership, but particularly an affordable rental, the reason why all of our work exists and why this is such a big need is because the market cannot provide affordable housing at truly affordable levels. And why I say that is because that, as Carla stated really well, folks below a certain income level just cannot afford to pay what it actually costs to operate housing. So a huge part of our job is trying to bridge the gap between what people can afford and what it costs. And what we have seen is that I would say years ago, so we're under what we would call this LIHTC, low income housing tax credit, for folks who are on the call, which is the 1986, I believe. You want to go deep down the history of when that program came in, which was kind of become the biggest way that we produce affordable housing. And it's really focused on enticing investors to invest in developing affordable housing. So what I like to say is that we have a system that has done a lot, but it's really focused on investors and developers. The residents, we just assume that they're going to benefit. And a lot of people do. I think we do good work. There is a lot there, but we don't really have a resident focused system. So we can maybe get back to that later in the podcast. But I think the challenges is that in that system, while it's worked decently well for a lot of years, as we've seen huge increases in costs of everything from materials to other goods, but also things like insurance, the cost of maintaining property insurance, which is not an optional thing, to just the bigger disparities in terms of incomes. More and more folks just don't have enough income, and our prices keep rising. And we are like to say over the years, we hold it together with duct tape. It's more like Scotch tape or maybe some sort of like chewing gum. We're doing our best to hold the system together. And what we really need is investment from the public sector to match what it actually takes to do this work. Because that's ultimately what it takes. It takes subsidy to make this work. We have to collectively understand how to do that. So I could talk all day, but I'll maybe kick it back to you so you can hear from someone else.
No, I appreciate that, Will. Thank you. And Carl and Will both covered a lot of ground. But I do want to give other folks a chance. Jesse, Kirsten, do you have anything, Kizzy, that you want to add to what was already said?
I would just add that I agree, Carla's point about kind of that we just don't have enough affordable housing, I think is really a tension point with the piece around preserving what we do have. And so, Alliance has a 17, 18-year-old building that we're really struggling with figuring out what a path is to preserve the housing as a really decent and high quality place for the residents to live. So I think there's this tension right now between producing more units, which are very needed, but keeping the units we have healthy for the community. And I think that's the tension that really, really needs to be resolved, because they both need to happen.
Great. Thank you.
Just gonna-
Kristen, yeah, Kizzy.
I was just gonna kind of throw in there. I think the kind of dynamics around what it takes to make sure individuals and families are kind of thriving in affordable housing. So I know Carla alluded to kind of more so we think about it with supportive housing, but even in kind of what are traditionally considered affordable developments, there is kind of a need for some service coordination a lot of times, because folks are just kind of on this continuum in terms of needing some support. And I think that that is not something that is traditionally considered or even thought about when we're doing affordable housing, because it takes a lot to just construct the buildings and operate them and manage them. And so I think that when we think about kind of the and I know we're going to talk about this next, the federal policies and things that kind of can sometimes provide funding to support this when there's uncertainty around that. It makes it even harder because developers and service providers have fewer options to turn to even fund a lot of the service needs around housing folks as well. So that was just my 2 cents.
Appreciate that, Kizzy. Thank you.
And maybe I'll just add some nuance as an organization that works in the affordable homeownership space. There's a tension with the reality that the private market can move faster than us in acquiring and purchasing homes. And we still are dealing with some of the same struggles with homeowners who are increasingly being priced out or can't afford their home with rising costs of insurance and property taxes, and things that are, pricing them out of the home that they purchased and invested in. And kind of the interplay there is it makes preservation of those homeownership opportunities even more important because we can build and we do build, but we can't build at the same scale as we can protect existing housing options. And we really don't have a lot of tools available to us to either keep people in their homes once they're there. So there's a need for more robust investment in post-purchase support and financial resources to help those who are struggling to afford their homes and maintain their homes, but also to be proactive. And this isn't like a jab at investor ownership, but on the national level, investor ownership is on the rise again. And I think that is just a symptom of the fact that they can compete quicker than we have, and they have more tools at their disposal, or more capital at their disposal than we have. And so we need to be proactive about helping that existing homeowner either stay in their home or helping them transition out of that home, but preserving that for the next homeowner that's available. So putting resources in place that are meant to do that, not to combat investors, but to really protect what we've already worked so hard to do, which is put people into affordable homeownership opportunities.
Thank you, Kirsten. And I do want to get later into more of the tools, the specific tools that do exist today to help folks with that. But as Kizzy mentioned, I want to talk about the federal funding piece. And so, Kizzy, I'm actually going to start with you on this question. Just help us understand why HUD matters to affordable housing. And we'll start there. Why is HUD important, and the impact that it has on affordable housing, in addition to the impact that the federal government has on affordable housing?
Well, I mean, HUD is important because, whether it's here in the state of Minnesota or just across the nation, HUD leverages a lot of money and resources that really helps to fund a lot of public housing, a lot of the, like Kirsten mentioned, a lot of the home ownership work, the counseling that a lot of our organizations do for folks looking to move into home ownership, a lot of the rental assistance programs. So when we think about affordable housing, there are different aspects of funding that it takes to move people, either like maybe they're starting at one place before they move into affordable housing. And so HUD provides a lot of money and resources to help people kind of move along that continuum. And so right now, obviously with a lot of cuts that have been put in place and a lot of policy changes, that is definitely threatening the ability for us to kind of do the work that we're already doing. There's already not enough affordable housing that's been mentioned. And so the cuts and the changes are making the work that we're already doing, that we're kind of behind on, it's making it harder to move the needle. So that's why HUD is important, is because they hold a lot of infrastructure in terms of helping us do the work that we do locally. And the changes that are happening, it's definitely making waves in terms of how it's impacting our landscape here in Minnesota.
That's right. Jesse, how are you seeing this in your work?
Yeah, I mean, as a operator in the rental housing space, HUD is just the critical resource in providing rental assistance or rental subsidy. And I think this kind of gets to a misperception that I think often exists in affordable housing, in that, when you see these project awards, $33 million to build this new building. That's an amazing amount of money. And believe me, it's hard to believe sometimes, but that's just to build the building. And I think there's a misconception a lot of times that funding provides ongoing funding to help keep rents low. But the reality is that we need an ongoing source like HUD rental subsidy to help keep rents at an affordable level for people based on their income. And so, in the rental housing space, to me, that's really the role that HUD plays, and it's critical. Their incomes cannot afford the rent and the cost that it takes us as operators to run the building in a high quality way. So we need that subsidy to operate. It's critical.
That's right. That's right. Will, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
I would like to add, great points, especially around kind of the difference between constructing versus the ongoing. That's what I hit on earlier with the developer focus versus, resident focus. But another thing, just as we talk about HUD and its importance, just to take a step back, a fact that I learned a number of years ago that has always astounded me, and I like to share when we think around what the impact of government subsidy is in the housing space. Because when we think about housing subsidies from the federal government and HUD, we think of things like the Section 8 program, rent subsidies, or construction subsidies. But actually, the single largest source of subsidy for housing is the home mortgage interest deduction, which, if you think about it, that is actually in the tax code. If you are a homeowner, and this is again not bounded by income, there is no income limit, so you can be a billionaire and take the home mortgage interest deduction on a property that you live in. The expenditure in terms of lost tax revenue for that, at least as of a few years ago, it's probably changed since then. I believe the home mortgage interest deduction expenditure was double of the entire HUD budget. All of the money that we put into home ownership, affordable rental programs, and the like. So when we think around the impact of the federal government and HUD on housing, I just don't want to lose that it's in the context of we are modeling that we can actually invest and that all of us get our housing subsidized one way or the other. We have to be intentional about how we allocate those dollars. And so how could we do what Jesse's saying, which is actually not just put in one-time investments to build buildings, but actually make sure that folks can afford to keep renting their home, as Chris was talking about, the folks in first-time home buyers and who have more moderate incomes can afford property tax increases and insurance increases, all of those things. So I'll leave it there, but I think that's maybe a fact for the day.
Yeah, no, really appreciate that, Will. And I'm gonna actually switch up a little bit and just ask you all, like, what are some ways that HUD can more specifically address this reality of income gap? So let's get concrete here. We've already named that stock exists, but folks can't afford it. We've already named that affordability exists, but folks can't maintain it. Organizations can't maintain it. And the reality is that incomes are not keeping pace with the rising cost of housing in addition to inflation. So what are some of the specific tools that HUD could better leverage in order to meet the folks that we work with where they're at? And for this one, I'm going to go to Carla first.
I had a feeling you were going to throw this curveball to me. I appreciate it, though. Well, I do want to go back to, because I think Will and Jesse and Kizzy brought up some excellent points, but I do want to add one point before I switch to your question, which is we receive direct funding from HUD. 10% of our budget is federal funding, and HUD is the agency that funds us direct services for our residents. And what we got this go around were contracts with additional language that we really had to read through to make sure that we understood what we were agreeing to based on some of the executive orders that were coming out of Washington, D.C., and what risk we were willing to take by signing on to receive this funding. And so for a nonprofit to then be faced with, like, do we accept this money? And what does that mean if we accept it? We had to obtain legal counsel. We had to make sure that, what were we giving up? And could we produce what we said we were going to produce? And so that added just another complexity in addition to all the other things that were going on with HUD. So I just kind of wanted to add that part. But in terms of, the other thing that HUD does provide in terms of is access to healthcare and food. And so your question of what can be done is just an increased amount of resources so that, and we know that, food insecurity and healthcare insecurity. And now, when you start to tinker around with some of these programs that HUD has, really puts our most vulnerable population in a different category, as well as these new work requirements that may be coming through that, folks that are just transitioning out of experiencing homelessness for long term now saying, well, now you need to go get a job in order to qualify for certain affordability um, resources. It's just going to, so what I guess my answer is they got to roll a lot of that back. But that does not seem to be the path that they're taking.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Thank you for that. And Carla, I tossed you that because I knew you would dive in. So thank you. Kirsten, I'm going to hit you next with that same question. In the space of affordable home ownership and programming for affordable stability, where are the places where you feel like HUD can really just lean in harder to better support folks where they're at?
Yeah, I think a couple places. I think, as an organization that does home buyer education, but supports home buyers through the transaction and post-purchase, greater investment in our capacity to be able to serve as many clients as possible and stick with them post-closing will be tremendously helpful. There's so much being thrown at them in the pre-purchase space, and there's still so much to learn. And that, like, closing on the home is just the beginning of their homeownership journey. And we often stop our investment at that place. And so building towards being able to continue to support them with education and the tools and resources to be a sustainable homeowner, but also building out resources that actually support people when they're facing a crisis or an emergency. And then I think about a lot of our low and moderate income home buyers are utilizing FHA mortgages, which is underneath that larger umbrella, and how we can think about what we can create to create opportunities to modify those mortgages when people are struggling most, to be able to, like, when we don't have an abundance of resources, the next best thing we can do is build in time. And so how can we create opportunities to build in time to help people course correct, determine what's their best next step, move on from something if they just can no longer sustain it. But when we have to do it in crisis mode and rushed, it makes it incredibly difficult and not as holistic. And so resources to actually stick with people and supporting them, and thinking about the tools that people are using to even purchase homes and how we can create some opportunities to be more flexible and adaptable when people are facing crisis, especially when we have so many external forces that are pushing on people.
That's great, Kirsten. Thank you so much. I feel like, what you all kind of hit on was essentially the government getting at a human, more human-centered approach to support, to subsidy, which in and of itself does feel like a challenge to ask the government to be a little bit more personable and connected to what's happening on the ground. But with that, where are the places where you feel like the housing sector is covering the gaps that the government is currently leaving? And so I'm really getting at, what are the strengths that the affordable housing sector is really delivering on today? And for this question, I think I'm going to start with Will.
Oh, thanks. It's a good question. And I know, we can sometimes seem like kind of, negative Nellies or whatever when we talk about all the issues, but I think there are a lot of strengths. And one, I mean, first of all, this is, 5 of us representing 5, I think pretty awesome organizations, some of my favorite organizations here locally, but we are only 5, and there's actually quite a lot of others. The Twin Cities in particular, I think one of our biggest strengths is we have this incredible network of community development organizations. And we also, I would say, collectively, and this is at every level from local government to state government to the nonprofit sector to the philanthropic sector to individual donors and individual community members, we have made the choice to really invest in affordable housing. We have, I mean, it's one of the complicated parts of our job, but like I'm sure, Carla mentioned 3 new buildings coming online. I'm sure each of them have like 12 to 25 sources of funding that include the city and the county and the state and the Met Council and blah, 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 because there's money available at all those levels. That does not exist in every state. That does not exist everywhere. Here in the Twin Cities, we are really fortunate to have a lot of folks who care about affordable housing and want to invest in it. And it's always part of the challenge is figuring out how best to do that. But the fact that we have that, I think, is a real huge bedrock thing that we've been able to build off of, and that continued support, I think, is what gives me optimism that when we have these challenges, we will find a way through because we have a real strong base to build from.
Thanks for that, Will. Kizzy, what's your take on this?
Well, I like where Will went with the investment, and I think the return on the investment is also kind of the strength. Like when there's affordable housing and home ownership in communities, I mean, the social return on investment is deep. There's jobs, there's educational outcomes for the folks who have stability as a result of the housing infrastructure that's put in place, by the housing that is created, through affordable housing and home ownership. I think healthcare access for people who now have housing stability is much greater. So I think that in all of that, like when there's healthy people, like communities are healthier. So I think the just the return on the investment itself, and then there's a tax base. People are working. There's more that we're returning to the community as a result of people being more stably housed. So that's my take on it.
That's great, Kizzy. Thank you. Jesse.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I think I was thinking some of the same thoughts as Kizzy and Will. I think, people understand the importance of housing across communities. People understand the importance. And so I think a lot of our strength and strength of our work is just the wide net of folks that we have that care about this issue, the staff, the residents, the donors, the elected officials. I mean, I feel like people, when I say I work in affordable housing to any group of people, there's usually some kind of, oh, yeah, like in our community, we have this thing going on. And so I just think a lot of our strength is the people, very creative people who've been doing this work for a long time, who are committed really to finding new solutions right now. I think that's part of where we're at, is this point of what's next. I think that's a lot of our strength.
Thanks, Jesse.
Yeah.
Kirsten.
Know that I have anything different to say. I mean, I think everyone touched on points that I think stand out to me. I think it's who is in this space working. We are collaborative by nature. I see an ecosystem of folks who really work hard to work together and to lift each other up and lift up our different strategies. We all serve different parts of the affordable housing ecosystem. And we do that in a way that allows as many people as possible in our region to be served. And I think that's fundamentally why we exist. We step in where the market doesn't. That's everything that we're trying to do every day with every strategy we develop, with every investment we make, with every unit we put on the market. It's to actually solve for the gaps that our private market has already created.
That's right. Thank you, Kirsten. And Carla, take us home.
Yeah, oh God, so much to say. So, Will, I just appreciate you saying that, we are our own worst critic. Having moved from Detroit here 4 years ago, and I'm walking around, I'm like, why is anybody complaining? Like, the resources here, when I compare and when I travel outside of Minnesota, and I do say I work in this space and I'm from Minnesota, a lot of states are very envious of us. And so, we may not have it perfect and we will continue to try to get that perfection, but just know that there are people all over this country that are looking to us and at us and saying, wow, you guys have really figured it out. And so I'm glad you kicked off with that. The other thing I'll add is that we do have this housing stability coalition that's come together. It's better than each individual organization going to the Capitol and saying, here's what we need. And we kind of banded together and said, what are our priorities going to be? So it's kind of like one sound, one band, one voice that how we're showing up. And the other thing I'll add is recently I was at the Greater MSP and they're talking about how the disparities between Black and white home ownership has decreased by, like we're starting to see some headways in that. And that's the work that Kirsten and others are doing, which is incredible. But what I found, and I said, I think the narrative is that we saw the disparities. And what do? We put a ton of resources towards it. All that down payment assistance, the counseling that's happening, between the private sector, the public sector, philanthropic communities coming together to say, how do we reduce the disparities? And that's a strength that you do not find in other states and other communities, that we can identify a problem and then put a strategy around it and put funding around it and resources around it to try to reduce the disparities that we see. So I'll kind of just, but that Kirsten, I'm sure, could speak more to that, but I'll kind of leave it at that for me.
Great, Carla. I really appreciate it. And Kristen, this next question I'm actually going to toss right to you. So if you want to build off what Carla said, that'll be perfect. Outside of government support, because we kind of talked about that in depth, what are the other things that the affordable housing sector would really benefit from, say, from the private sector or just different aspects of our community?
Yeah, to think about this for a minute, because when I thought about this question, my mind goes to an adaptive challenge that I think we all have. Like, we need a bit of a recalibration. And I think what I'm reacting to, and it speaks both to Carla's point about we identify a problem and we resource it, right? Like, we go all in. At the same time, there's a widening gap between the outcomes that are expected of affordable housing providers and the resources that are available to achieve them, right? We may go all in on one piece and there's other pieces that are missing. And that's the challenge of this work. That's the push and pull of this work. But we are consistently being asked to reach buyers that the private market doesn't serve. We need to deliver on stability and we need to innovate our way out of systemic gaps. But we are doing that under funding sources that have some rigid compliance frameworks, and a lot of times we're doing this work on fairly thin margins. And I already talked a little bit about kind of how things are increasingly becoming unattainable. I know that the Minnesota Realtors just put out a report that the median home price just exceeded $400,000, and for the first time, which means people need upwards of $100,000 in income to be able to afford a home in our market. And then the costs are squeezing on both ends. So we're a developer and a home buyer support organization. Labor and construction costs are increasing our ability to build new affordable units. When those costs increase, that reduces how many we can produce. And then insurance rates and property taxes and interest rates are challenging buyers on their ability to afford it. So it's more expensive to buy, it's more expensive to build, it's more expensive to preserve. And our ambitious goals have not changed, and our funding sources are not keeping pace with the scale of the issue and the widening gap. And so when I think about that, that's the work we all committed to. That's the work we are doing every day. And it's the work that we have to continue to do, but we also have to recalibrate our expectations to reflect kind of what our current market conditions are putting in front of us. We have to think about affordability in a way that actually allows people to sustain the opportunities that we're putting in front of them. But we also have to acknowledge the true cost of delivering on these outcomes. And I think about the cost it takes for all of us to plan, to develop strategy, to test and pilot solutions, to get to that place. All of that costs money, and that's separate from the hard costs of just implementing what we built. And so acknowledging those costs and really ensuring that our resources can match that, and level setting expectations across the entire sector, because I think it creates tension between what communities demand and deserve and what we're able to actually deliver on. And then the real thing is that it all has a cost, and our work is to determine who's going to pay for it and why. Because we're never going to be able to do this work without it being resourced. We need the resources to be able to serve the communities that we are here to serve. And so I name that as like, it's an adaptive challenge. We're all here, we're head down, we're doing the work. And at some point, the market's just starting to outpace us, and we have to reset and say, all right, what can we do under these new conditions, and how do we actually need to shift versus continuing to try to force our existing tools and resources to make the same outcomes happen?
Thank you, Kirsten. That was incredible. Kizzy, do you have anything to add to that?
You were gonna make me go after Kirsten's like that. She just dropped the mic. Like, we should just
She did. She really did drop the mic there.
The only thing that I can even think to add is just kind of building on what she just said about the resources, is also the people power to do it. I think speaking from the perspective of a kind of smaller community based organization, budget under $5 million, doing community development work, had conversations with many of you on this call about how we, and some of us are partnering together to think about doing development. So I think it's even like how we do it differently, because we really don't often have the capacity. Like there's the need and there's the willingness to do certain projects that maybe a larger developer, it doesn't make sense for them to do certain projects, but it does make sense for a smaller developer to do it. But not always having all the capacity built within your organization. But sometimes it's about partnering with certain other organizations where you might be able to do certain aspects of the development project and they might be able to do others, and you still can get work done. So I think it's what Kirsten was saying is that we've got to look at like how we're doing development too. Like the model has to be different, and like we've been partnering community developers, or developers have been doing partnerships for a long time, but I think we're being a lot more thoughtful about like intentionally doing it that way. So for us as an organization, I know we're definitely thinking about that and doing it, and I think you're probably going to see a lot more of it, and it makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways.
Great. Thank you, Kizzy. Carla.
Sure. I just want to add, what I believe the sector needs is regulatory relief or flexibility when it comes to some of the projects that we currently have that are housing folks. We have a number that in our portfolio that if we were able to kick the AMI from, let's say, 50% AMI to 60%, that the property would cash flow in a much productive way that would cover some of those unintended, unexpected costs that we talked about earlier, like insurance, like security. So I think that having that flexibility and right now you can go to the state and you can ask for them to look at your portfolio and they'll look at that project, but they do it case by case. And when we talk about that we're in an affordable housing crisis, we really need folks to act like it's a true crisis with some expediency in how they can have these flexible regulatory constraints that are put on a lot of our developments.
Thank you, Carla. Will.
Well, I'm really glad you're recording this because I want to be able to clip what Kirsten said earlier and probably reuse that because I think it was spot on. And I just want to build off of what she said in one particular way, which is that so much of, because you kind of, as you said, Kirsten, it's adaptive. And so a lot of funding, we put funding in a problem. But one of the things, and especially, having been here now 17 years, I've gotten to see some cycles. Like, unfortunately, sometimes what we do is we run to this problem and we forget about all this other stuff. And we kind of, it's like a boat, like swaying back and forth. And what we really need, this work is long-term work. Community development, affordable housing, this is long-term work. We need some stability. And I'm looking particularly at our philanthropic community. Again, we've got an incredible philanthropic community here in the Twin Cities. That's part of why there's so many organizations. But I don't think I'm talking out of school here to say that like sometimes they kind of chase the thing and they gotta please a lot of interest. And so the dollars move. And so you might have been funded for 3 years for something. And then all of a sudden, well, that's over. And now we're moving on to this other thing. That is really hard to keep staff to plan budgets. As an example, what if we thought about it? And I know we're not in the same world as the corporate world, but my wife works at a medical device company. She's way more brilliant than me. So it's not fair to compare us, but she, in her world, our entire budget is like, I don't want to call it a rounding error, but it's almost a rounding error, like Hope's annual budget. When they talk about development of new initiatives or new products or the things that they need to do, it's just, we're talking such different scales. And I'm not saying that we should have it try to exactly mirror the corporate world, but we're in a reality where those big funding shifts and funding cycles, we just aren't matching the resources with what it actually takes, which is what Kirsten said. So I think that's the point.
Absolutely. That is the point. We need more resources, both human capital and funding capital, which is what folks have called out. Jessie, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I just really think we're in a time where the industry as a whole needs to innovate, and not just us as providers, but the whole space. And we need some new models. I mean, all the work we do has costs. And one thing I've been thinking of recently is how much cost it causes when we layer funding on each other. All the different sources. It's cool that we have that many sources in Minnesota, but it also is very costly that we have that many, because then we have to comply with all of them, and we have to write all those applications. And so, like, what if each funder just agreed to take one project? And I know, though, that comes with other things, right? That comes with risk. But I just think we need really big picture new models and innovation, and it can't be kind of on the backs of the providers just to innovate your way out of this moment. It has to be kind of a systemic approach to finding new models. And, like, kind of like what Will was saying, I mean, other industries, they figure out when something's not working, and they make an investment, and they make a new way, and we have to collectively figure out how to do that.
That's great, Jesse. Thank you so much. And actually, you can go ahead and stay unmiked because I'm going to turn this next question to you first. So we hit on a lot of the realities of affordable housing. We hit on the strengths of our community, the strengths of being here in Minnesota, and we also went deep on the gaps. There's a lot of misconceptions that folks that don't work in affordable housing that they have about what it is and what it means and why it works or doesn't work or whether it should exist or not. And I'd love to just, a lot of the folks in the room today work in the sector, but a lot of the folks that will be listening to the podcast don't. And for their sake in particular, I'd love to just hit on what are some of those stereotypes that affect our work, both positively and negatively.
Mhm. Yeah, a couple of them that, I hear often when I'm sort of talking to people who are new to the space or curious about affordable housing. There's a assumption, misconception that people who live in housing that's considered affordable, that people don't work, that people don't pay rent. And there's kind of a deficit mentality thought of about people who work or live in affordable housing. And I think, often I like to, and it's really important that we share the strengths and the of the community and the people who live in affordable housing. And so I think there's often a lot of misconceptions just about who lives in affordable housing. And it's everybody. People pay rent, people work, people have community, have family. People's incomes just don't cover the cost of what it costs to rent housing. Then I think there's just a misconception of the piece I kind of talked about before, that affordable housing providers just get this massive amount of money to build, but really to operate the housing. I think that's the big misconception, is that there's actually funding to operate the housing. And the reality is that the affordable housing, it's run with rent. The resources and housing are rent, and that either comes from the person who lives in it or from some other source, but we rely on rent to run our housing. And so those are a few of the misconceptions that I feel like I come across often in my work.
Thank you. Kristen, I'm going to pop this one to you to talk specifically about what you're saying in the homeownership space.
Yeah, I think in homeownership and even in rental, one thing that I hear a lot that I think is a misconception, and even when we're talking about housing justice work, is that housing is a right. And I think that the idea that housing is a human right is a value we all hold deeply. I think many of us in this room do the work to try to create opportunities for everyone to have affordable and dignified housing. But from a very practical standpoint, it is not true. Our laws don't dictate it. Our funding structures don't dictate it. Our policies don't guarantee it. And I think that disconnect creates tension between who's getting access, who's seen as deserving, like how resources are being allocated, what work we're prioritizing year over year. And we need to talk about that more, because I think when we conflate a value for a structural truth, we are actually not addressing the root causes of why we have so many challenges in our affordable housing space. And I think it creates frustration around this shared belief that I think is spoken in many rooms and many coalitions that we want opportunities for everyone. And then the hard reality that we don't have what we need to be able to do that. And it's not embedded in our systems and it's not embedded in our structure. And it's an expectation that is somewhat of an unfunded and non-policy related mandate on our system. And I think that misconception is helpful and harmful in different ways. I think it's helpful because it points to a bright spot where there's so many of us that align around what's important and what work we need to do. But the harm comes in when we don't actually address the fact that when it gets down to the sausage making, it's not true.
Wow, Kirsten, I feel like again you dropped the mic. Let folks sit in that one for a minute. That was heavy. Carla, you have the pleasure of following that up with any.
Well, thank you. I just want to piggyback on what Jesse said. And I remember when I got to PPL and we were doing tours and we showed up at a building and the manager said, we can go in Mr. Jones's unit because he's a truck driver and he keeps his unit so meticulous. And he has always said, if you ever need to show one of the apartments, feel free to use my unit. And we walked in and it was just beautiful. And it was just like, he lived there. He was a truck driver, so he was on the road a lot, but he took pride in his home. And so I think another misconception is that not only Jesse talked about people are working, but that people don't care about where they're living. And, this is their home. And it was just the most beautiful thing that I had seen coming here, that he took so much pride that he wanted us to show it to other potential tenants that were going to be moving in the building. And so that people care that these are not, they want these to be safe and beautiful spaces. And we try to deliver on that as well.
Thank you, Carla. All right, Will.
All great points. Quickly, I want to try and highlight two things that I think are really true. One is that I think there's a kind of a misconception or a stereotype that affordable housing is just one thing, right? That it's, a lot of people equate like Section 8, right? The Section 8 program is affordable housing. And that is true. That is a big piece of it. But even here amongst all these colleagues, we all work on kind of different parts. It's an ecosystem. It is, it's also like kind of a really relative term, right? Like affordable to whom? Affordable housing could be something that's working with folks coming out of long-term homelessness. It could be folks who are at 30% of area median income or 50% or 60%, et cetera, et cetera. People getting into, first-time home buyers. All of those things are part of the affordable housing spectrum. So it's not a monolith. There is a lot of variation within that and a lot of reasons, frankly, why people might be in there. And I also just want to say, again, piggybacking off of Kirsten, I think because housing is not treated as a human right, which again, I love housing in action, by the way, how you've really embraced kind of the housing justice, housing as a human right framework. I think that is what we need to aspire to. That is the hopeful thing that we should be doing, but we don't really view it in a way of being necessary. And I think so one of Hope's buildings, actually the first one I ever got to work on, is called the Wellstone, named after the late Senator Paul Wellstone. And of course, his famous quote was, "We all do better when we all do better." And I think the way that I, have heard it referred to and like to try and frame it is that, housing really is infrastructure. Affordable housing is infrastructure. So even if you don't want to use human rights language, social justice language, it's actually really important to all of us that folks in our community can live affordably, because if they don't, what happens to them? What happens to the quality of life and to all of our community if people don't have affordable housing? We don't question that we need roads, right? Does anybody really scrutinize the road budget? I mean, maybe we should. I don't know what's in there. I don't know how much asphalt costs, but okay. So maybe we could get into that too. But if we treated affordable housing as infrastructure, even if it's not a human right, I think we could have a really different conversation around resources and thinking about the sector as a whole. So I just appreciate those comments.
Yeah, I appreciate that reflection. Will, Kizzy, we're gonna wrap this one up with you.
Wow. Yeah, I'm not. I feel like everyone has kind of said what I would probably have added. So I'm not. I don't have anything else to add to that particular one.
Awesome. Well, thank you. How about Kizzy? You lead us in our next reflection, which I'm going to divide into two parts. I'd love for you to talk about what you see as the future of affordable housing, whether that's in the development space, types of construction, the types of funding sources. And then I'd love if you could just end with kind of your dream. You know, it's like none of us are doing this work because we don't have hope and we don't have vision and we don't want to see specific outcomes. So I'd love for you to end there, Kizzy.
Sure. So, I mean, I think I see, some possibilities around affordable housing. I had a lot of different thoughts about this, but I think where I will land is just talking about the possibilities around kind of using maybe universal housing vouchers as a way to kind of help supplement the need for like structural, the supply kind of issue that everyone has alluded to. I think we need a continuum of options, and we need to continue to produce more housing stock, and it needs to be affordable. But the universal housing vouchers could also be a way to kind of, use where people are already housed, but to, use those opportunities to make sure that people have opportunities to kind of have affordable rents while they're housed, while because it's going to take time to build and preserve. So that's one thing that I've been thinking about. And then I think my dream for affordable housing is really just that, you know, when I think about the future, I have a little one. She's 8 years old, going on 20, and, I don't I hope that in 10, 15 years, that this conversation around housing and affordable housing is one that is not as, critical, that when her generation, and maybe one day when if she decides to, parent or to have a family, that the concern, the issues aren't around like whether there is enough affordable housing or how it's, if there's enough of it available for the next generation. I mean, I think that's some of the pressure that some of us feel is trying to make things better for the next generation to come. And so my dream is that we are able to at least put a big dent in helping to make sure that this issue is somewhat resolved for the next generation.
That's beautiful, Kizzy. Thank you. Carla.
Thank you. So, where I see the future is one, building more energy efficient housing. I think that's got to be as we try to address, the climate uh, needs in our community, in our region. I also think that, so for me, it is when I think about the future, regulatory relief, and then just more coordinated development. I loved when Kizzy was talking about working with other developers, because there's so much that can be gained out of that, right? That we all do better when we work together. But in the end, what I'm excited about is how we are being very intentional on how we are disposing of some of our smaller unit assets that we have in our portfolio, how we are targeting emerging developers to create generational wealth, like working with that pool of developers, um, just to see what they're able to do once they purchase properties that already have equity in it, that already we've invested millions of dollars into, that we're keeping affordable for at least the next 10 years. They will be better caretakers of these smaller duplexes, fourplexes, and sixplexes. Um, when we looked at our portfolio, we had 83 properties that are 19 units or lower. and we're building 110 units over at 3030 Nicollet. So for us, the economies of scale aren't there, but we know that there are people in this community that would love to become a property owner, that start to build their asset. And if we can be intentional as opposed to just putting things on the open market, taking the highest bidder, how we kind of recycle, we call it reseed, because we're reseeding these properties back to community. That gives me, I want to in 10 years come, look at kind of what happened with these emerging developers and what that asset did for not only their family and but also how were they able to leverage it. So that's a big project that I'm working on, and that is giving me great hope when I think about how we stabilize our portfolio, but being just intentional on where we dispose of these assets and who gets them, because not everybody we believe is worthy of owning these properties, and so that's where the future gives me great hope.
Awesome, Carla. Thank you so much. Let's go to Jesse.
All right, this is kind of my dream is kind of one of my soapboxes, but I think what I dream of is really how we simplify systems and streamline systems that make them aligned more to the person they're intended to serve. I think that our customer, our user is people who become housed. And so how do we simplify the system to meet folks where they're at? In the space of housing people who are unhoused, I think we haven't designed a system for people who are unhoused. We've designed a system for funders. We've designed a system for all these different entities, but we haven't designed a system that responds to somebody maybe who's living in an encampment. I see a lot of times our systems have lots of steps and lots of documents and requirements, and that's not really where someone sits when they're living unhoused. And so my dream is really how we simplify things and align them to the experience of the person it's intended to serve. And I think taking sort of a human-centered design framework and really redesigning our systems so that they're efficient, they're targeted to who they're supposed to serve. That's a dream of mine. And I think, we should be able to house someone tomorrow who comes in today. We should be able to do that. And that would be success, I think.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse. Any thoughts as to where you see the future, the short-term future, maybe of affordable housing heading?
I think, I think I agree with some of the points around partnership. People on this call have all been in different partnership conversations already. I think that this time of sort of feeling in a constrained moment opens these opportunities to say, hey, we could do this together and combine our strengths to go after this. I feel, Carla mentioned the Minnesota Housing Stability Coalition. I think some of those coalitions we've built have really helped us maybe lower the barriers between each other and open up that we're not competitors. We can really supplement each other's strength. So I know Hope and Alliance are starting to work on a collaboration together. That's been pretty exciting in two different spaces. Housing in Action and Alliance are starting some conversations. So I'm just really excited to see where we can start to look at our collective power and experience and skill to move forward.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Will.
Yeah, well, the dream, maybe I'll start with that. So my dream would be that all people, regardless of their income level, have meaningful choice in where they live. Because right now, that's true if you have above a certain level of income, right? If you have all the income in the world, you can choose anywhere you want to live. But the further down you go, and it's increasingly like you don't have to go that far down to be really constrained in what your options are. Whether it's which city, which neighborhood, et cetera. One of the programs we've done in the last 5 years is a community ownership program focusing on supporting folks who want to become owner occupants of small multifamily buildings. And one of the interesting things that we hear a lot from folks in that is folks have all kinds of different preferences of where they want to live, but there is a real fundamental mismatch of what neighborhoods are even remotely affordable to them, even with all the assistance that's available. And sometimes there's just a real mismatch. So how would we have a system that actually, the dream would be that actually those folks who are coming to us who want to live in whatever neighborhood that they can't currently afford, could they actually have that as a real option? That would be a real meaningful change. And so as to the future and where we're going, hope, so more on the rental side of how we're trying to address this. I mentioned earlier kind of like, how do we make a more resident focused system? I totally agree with what Kizzy said that, something like universal housing vouchers, things like that. I think we're at a point because so much has shifted around us from the federal level on down, we are at a moment where we're having to innovate. And so I see a bunch of innovation happening. All the things that were mentioned earlier are right. At Hope, one of the things we're doing, maybe in a not Minnesota modest way, trying to talk about a project that's called Reimagining Affordable Rental Housing, right? Like really shifting the system. And that's about actually making sure that no one in our buildings is cost burdened, because unfortunately in affordable rental housing, that is still quite possible in the current system. And that the buildings actually have enough to sustain themselves. And what that requires is really shifting, like I said, from subsidy and sources that focus on developer and investor needs first to ones that focused on resident needs and ongoing rent support. Universal vouchers will go a long way towards that goal. So that is my hope, and also what we're working hard on, not just wishing for it, we're working towards that to make that the future.
It's really exciting, Will. Every time I hear about it, I get excited. So I'm really happy for you guys. Kirsten.
Yeah, I think from my vantage point, my dream is that everyone who aspires to and achieves ownership gets to fully realize the benefits of it. And I really want to piggyback on what Carla shared about where I think Reseed is shifting the narrative and shifting opportunities that we see in our market. We really are fortunate to be in a housing system that is making the shift from just talking about affordable homeownership to affordable homeownership for the purpose of wealth creation, and actually thinking about how we leverage that as a vehicle for closing racial wealth disparities or addressing racial wealth disparities. And what I'm excited about is that we can talk about who gets to own in our communities and how that supports both the occupants of rental housing, but the wealth creation of having local owners be present in our community. And on the owner occupied side, I'm really excited about this movement towards shorter term forgivable buyer assistance, because when we started in this space, we have a lot of long-term debt on these properties that people are owning, which fundamentally shifts their ability to leverage this for a wealth building vehicle or this investment towards anything other than just living in it. And when we create these opportunities that debt will be forgiven in someone's lifetime of wanting to make changes, or their family growing, or emergencies popping up, we actually start to change the opportunities that are related to investing in people getting into home ownership. And I think about it in terms of, on one end, I want to solve for kind of the lack of resources and tools we have available to help people if they're experiencing a crisis after home ownership. But what if people can actually tap their own equity and leverage their own equity in their investment to solve for that emergency maintenance or repair need, or to make an improvement for their growing family, or to pull money out to pay for college for one of their kids? Like, we actually are shifting the way that homeownership works as a wealth building vehicle, and we are moving in that direction. And so I think as we continue to see programs like this invested in and provide a proof of concept that it can work and that people are deserving of these opportunities in the way they were intended to work, we will get to a place where we'll be able to leverage those investments and see a shift in kind of the economic realities of the families that we're serving. And so that gets me really excited.
Awesome. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, all of you. It is inspiring to hear your dreams as well as the different projects that folks are working on. We're going to shift now to a couple of audience questions. And so again, folks in the audience, feel free to continue to pop your questions into the chat. Our first question from the audience And I'm going to start with you, Will, on this one. Can anything be done about the impact of increasing property taxes on families in affordable houses?
It's a great question. And obviously, I think one that's really important for those aspiring homeowners, Kirsten was just talking about kind of like folks who get into homeownership, they realize that dream. And sometimes, particularly here, in our central cities, what's happening is as more and more of the tax base is shifting away from industrial and commercial towards residential. That's just leading, you can take whole classes on how property taxes work because they're so complicated, but essentially it's driving them upwards in a lot of places and, in a large way. So I have heard all kinds of interesting ideas out there, everything from, more progressive forms of property taxes in the first place, right? Where it's more shaded towards the higher valuation properties and kind of, those things, to different kind of programs that target more relief. One of the things actually, and again, just back to like the fact that we do have pretty good systems, we do have already some relief for folks of more modest income levels. It's just not really enough. And one of the biggest things that I think is a struggle is the changes from year to year, because that's what I think really hurts people. You budget for something. Ownership is in some ways the greatest form of rent control, to kind of liken the two, because it's like you've got a predictable payment except for your taxes and insurance. And when those things spike, that can really, for people on fixed incomes especially, make it really hard. So what I do know is that there's, again, lots of innovation out there. I'm not the expert on like all the mechanisms, but I think what we need to do, and that's really at the city and kind of county level, and I guess maybe some state law changes probably have to happen to make some of those things happen. I'd love to see us try some ways to really focus what kind of relief looks like as more and more of the tax base shifts to residential. So for folks who've gotten into affordable ownership, how do they not get priced out by tax increases?
Thank you, Will. Kirsten, anything to add on this piece?
Well, I think Will hit a lot of the points that I would have made, and it's just complicated. It's because there's so much more that goes into your property taxes than just the estimated value of your home. And when people are already struggling financially, you might also be seeing things like assessments get added in, right? So the costs are getting driven up from a lot of different things that put pressure, and that's the line item that it falls into. At PRG, we do some support for low to moderate income seniors with the tax deferral program that is available. And it's not widely visible to a lot of folks, but we do our best, especially in the foreclosure prevention space, to utilize that tool as sometimes a last resort to keep people in a more comfortable payment opportunity. But I would love to think about ways that we could learn from that model and maybe expand the opportunity for that type of tool to meet other people's needs around rising property taxes and the impact that it has on monthly payments. It's not perfect, but it is, again, when we don't have money, having time can be helpful.
Thank you, Kirsten. Carla.
I don't have anything to add. I think you're hearing from the expert herself, Kirsten, who does this every day. I don't have anything to add.
Awesome. All right. Anyone else have anything you'd like to add?
I don't have anything to add because I am not the expert, but I will say that just as we talked about kind of work that is happening in coalitions, I know Kirsten, I think most of us are involved in the Home Coalition, Home Ownership Minnesota coalition, and that is working diligently to kind of move efforts in the home ownership space. So again, these are things that there's a collective group of providers working to kind of move legislation and policy forward. So there are avenues in place that if we do have good ideas, we can bring them before the coalition and see if those are things that we can work on as a group.
Well, with that, that will wrap up our session today. So thank you all so much. Thank you for the folks that, joined us today, and the folks that added your questions to this conversation. Super grateful to have the interest that we have in this conversation. And of course, huge thanks to our panelists, who are doing incredible work at their organizations. Please look up these orgs if you don't know of them. Those new to Housing in Action, make sure you're also following us on social media. We are at Housing in Action across all social media platforms. We will include links to the websites of all of these incredible organizations in our show notes. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful afternoon. And that is the end of our podcast today.
Thank
Yeah.
Thank you.
Here at Housing in Action, we acknowledge that we live our lives and do our work on land that European colonizers stole from the Dakota peoples indigenous to Minnesota. In order for this theft to occur, sadistic acts of genocide, rape, and forced assimilation were employed. We also acknowledge that we live our lives and do our work on land that was cultivated and developed by bodies that European colonizers stole from the West African countries through the transatlantic slave trade. In order for these thefts to occur, sadistic acts of genocide, rape, and forced assimilation were employed. We acknowledge what was taken from our collective human ancestors. As we do so, we commit to work and fight for the liberation of the descendants of those enslaved through American chattel slavery and the sovereignty of all Native American peoples.
Thank you so much for tuning into Reclaiming Home for today's discussion. If you like this podcast and want to support Housing in Action's work, find us on socials at Housing in Action or visit our website at www.housinginaction.org. Until next time, remain connected and informed.